The human being doesn't seek truth. He seeks acceptance. From the cradle, he learns to shape his essence, not to understand the world, but to be tolerated by it. And this effort, almost always unconscious, is what slowly corrodes his wholeness. You may call it education, civilization, moral refinement, but it is essentially a violent polishing. The raw self is sculpted until it fits and can be displayed. The cost? The soul fragments. Montaigne was one of the few to say it out loud. In his essays, he wasn't trying to teach, he was trying to endure, to describe his condition, to make it possible to live with himself. And there's something he shares with you. Exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of the body, not of the routine, but the existential fatigue of someone who must become palatable just to avoid abandonment.
They call it socialization, politeness, adaptability. But what they don't say, what they never say, is that this process often teaches a person not how to live, but how to disappear without anyone noticing. Piece by piece, the self is amputated. A sharp comment here, a judgmental glance there, a punishment dressed as guidance. Soon the child realizes authenticity is dangerous. To be fully seen is to risk exile. And so begins the performance. One learns to nod, to smile, to avoid saying what stirs discomfort, and gradually to avoid being what disturbs. It starts early, the art of translation, of turning inner truth into acceptable noise. The girl with too much intensity becomes dramatic. The boy who questions too much becomes disrespectful. The adult who disagrees becomes difficult. The lesson is clear. Shape yourself into what others can tolerate. What no one tells you is that this shaping never stops, that it becomes habit, then identity, then prison. Until one day you can no longer tell whether what you do is a choice or just a long echo of what made you feel safe. And the scariest part? You might even succeed. You might become exactly what they hoped. Predictable, pleasant, easy to categorize. But something in you will rot. Not all at once, just enough to numb you. You won't scream. You'll sigh. You won't break. You'll fade. And everyone around you will say, "Look how well adjusted they are," not realizing that what they're praising is your burial in slow motion.
It doesn't begin with a scream. It begins with a discomfort. A glance in the mirror that feels unfamiliar. A compliment that lands in a hollow space. A conversation that feels scripted, rehearsed. It's not depression. It's not drama. It's a quiet rebellion from something deep within, tired of being silenced. He doesn't explode. He recedes. He begins to cancel small plans, to avoid certain faces, to choose silence over performance. And no one understands, because on the outside, everything seems intact. But inside, the mask is cracking. Not from pressure, but from disuse. He no longer knows what he truly likes, what excites him, what he believes, what he desires. Because for so long, he desired what others wanted him to desire. And now, without that script, he feels naked.
But it is precisely in that nakedness that truth begins to emerge. Not loudly, not clearly, just undeniably. The self he buried never left. It only waited, quietly, for the moment he'd grow tired of pretending.
There's a hunger no one talks about. Not the hunger for food, nor for touch, but for being seen as one truly is. It's the hunger of a child who learned early that honesty comes with consequences, that intensity makes people uncomfortable, that truth, when raw, is too heavy for most to carry. So they tone it down, sand the edges, swallow the questions. And the applause comes, but it never fills, because praise, when earned by self-erasure, only deepens the void. But few are taught how to build that inner shop. Most build mirrors instead, reflecting only what others expect to see. And the worst part is, this hunger doesn't scream, it whispers. It whispers in moments of silence, in the discomfort after laughter, in the empty feeling after a compliment. You smile, they admire you, you nod. But inside, something tightens, something aches. Not because they didn't see you, but because they never really could. They've only ever met your most presentable fragments. And you fed on that for so long, you almost believed it was enough. But it never is. Because what we crave is not being celebrated, it's being known. And that demands a courage few ever cultivate. The courage to stop performing, even if it means being alone.
The world will never say, "You've given too much of yourself." It will say, "You're not trying hard enough." And so he tries, again and again. He says yes when he means no, smiles when he wants silence, volunteers when he wants to rest. He bends until he forgets he can stand. And the reward? Another week of being perceived as strong, as generous, as admirable. But what they admire is his disappearance. They love the version of him that never asks, never resists, never complicates. He begins to notice his exhaustion doesn't come from doing too much, but from doing everything without truly being there. The fatigue isn't physical, it's ontological. It's the weight of days filled with actions that mean nothing to the soul that performs them. He has become a ghost, haunting the life he built to be loved. And now, that ghost wants out. Not to destroy anything, but to breathe. To finally exist without explanation. There comes a moment, not dramatic, not loud, when the body continues, but the spirit stops. The machine keeps working. The calendar remains full. The mouth still smiles, but something inside refuses to follow. It's the collapse that occurs not when one fails, but when one succeeds in everything they were told would bring fulfillment and still feels nothing. They told him that being liked was enough, that being respected would calm the storm, that recognition would quiet the hunger. So he obeyed. He played the part. He perfected the image. And yes, the doors opened, the nods came, the applause arrived. But no one noticed that each new approval drained him a little more, because the applause never reached the place that truly mattered. He had mastered the role, but forgotten the actor. And now he sits in silence, not from peace, but from exhaustion, the exhaustion of being everything except himself. It doesn't start with courage. It starts with nausea.
a growing discomfort with what once felt normal, with conversations that echo emptiness, with roles played without conviction, with mirrors that reflect a stranger. He doesn't yet know what to do, but he knows he can't keep doing this. That's how awakening begins, not with clarity, but with revulsion. And he's not cheerful. He's tired, not because life is cruel, but because he's lived it as someone else, a character, a version, a costume sewn from expectations. Now, the seams are tearing, not violently, but persistently. He finds himself staring out windows longer, saying less, pausing more. Not to seem mysterious, but because words feel expensive when they no longer serve a mask. What rises in him isn't rage, it's a quiet hunger for something that doesn't yet have a name. Not happiness, not success, presence, perhaps even peace. But it can't come until he stops negotiating his essence for crumbs of approval.
The exhaustion doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive like a storm. It accumulates, like dust on furniture no one remembers to clean. It's subtle, silent, socially acceptable. It looks like being responsible, like having it all together, like doing what needs to be done. But deep down, it is the exhaustion of someone who has made their life a long act of moderation. Moderating tone, moderating gestures, moderating even their desires until they become palatable, modest, harmless. They call it maturity, but sometimes it's just well-dressed surrender. The person works, responds, functions. They fulfill their roles. They comply. But if you listen closely, you'll hear the sound of something missing, a pulse that no longer beats for itself. They no longer dream recklessly, no longer speak with urgency, no longer cry without apology. They have become efficient, and in that efficiency, the soul has withered. It's not sadness that defines them. It's a soft, chronic numbness, a state of internal drought. They're not dead, but they're no longer truly alive. And yet, everyone congratulates them. You're so balanced, so composed, so mature. But they know something sacred was traded, and what was gained in applause was lost in truth.
He doesn't rebel. He reclaims, not loudly, not with fists, but with absence. He stops explaining himself, stops apologizing for needing time, stops nodding when silence feels more honest. And at first, it terrifies him, because for so long, his identity was built on echoes, on reactions, on applause. Without them, who is he? He begins to walk differently, slower, not because he's in pain, but because he no longer needs to rush toward approval. He listens differently, not to respond, but to feel. He chooses differently, not based on what will be applauded, but on what doesn't betray him. It's not a revolution, it's a remembering. And memory, when it returns, doesn't ask permission, it simply reveals. He's not becoming someone new. He's recovering the one who was buried beneath layers of
strategy, charm, and obedience. And as this self resurfaces, so does something else. A sense of quiet joy, the kind that doesn't need to be shared to be real.
It's easier to fear rejection than to fear emptiness. Easier to say, "I'm afraid they won't like me," than to admit, "I don't know who I am without their approval." This is the final cage, not society, not others, but the internal dependence on validation. Because to let go of it is to risk discovering what remains when all applause ceases. And that is terrifying. He sits with himself, without distractions, without noise, without performance. And the silence is deafening. It brings old wounds to the surface, questions long avoided, griefs never named. But it also brings something else, a faint pulse, a subtle rhythm that feels his. It doesn't need confirmation, it doesn't beg to be admired, it simply is. And in that isness, a possibility is born. That maybe, just maybe, being isn't about being liked. That perhaps the most radical act of freedom is to be without asking permission.
Freedom doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with solitude, with the strange lightness of no longer needing to explain yourself. Not because you've become indifferent, but because you've stopped negotiating your presence. He begins to say no, not to punish, but to preserve. He begins to disappear from places where his silence was only useful as decoration. He begins to speak less, but when he does, it's no longer for effect. He has lost the appetite to convince others of anything. And in this strange detachment, a paradox arises. He becomes more himself and more connected to what's real. What he thought was loneliness was actually detox, withdrawal from the addiction of needing to be mirrored to feel alive. And now he is no longer hungry for reflections. He doesn't crave being liked. He doesn't fear being misunderstood, because what he's finally found cannot be given by others, and therefore cannot be taken. It's not a role. It's not a performance. It's presence. Naked, solid, unnegotiable.
He no longer fits. Not because he has changed too much, but because he stopped pretending. His presence makes others uncomfortable, not because he attacks, but because he doesn't bend, because he doesn't play the game of eternal accommodation. And in a world addicted to appearances, authenticity is violent. It dismantles unspoken rules. It reveals the game for what it is, a circus of fragile masks clapping for each other. He sees more clearly now, not because he's superior, but because he's not desperate. And the lack of desperation is mistaken for arrogance. They say he's distant, that he's changed, that he's not the same. They're right. He's no longer what they projected, no longer what they demanded, no longer what he used to trade himself for. And that is his greatest defense. He no longer feeds the system. He no longer bleeds for approval. He simply is. And that is offends those who don't know how to be.
He speaks less, not out of coldness, but because words now are sacred. He appears less, not out of fear, but because he no longer wants to decorate emptiness. He is no longer everywhere. He is entirely where he is. Presence becomes substance. Silence becomes power. And those who used to depend on his masks begin to drift away, not because he pushed them, but because he stopped performing. Now he knows himself, not as a definition, but as a rhythm. Some days loud, others invisible, but always aligned. He no longer rushes to fill silence. He no longer dresses pain in polite phrases. He no longer apologizes for needing space. He is not trying to be loved. He is not trying to be feared. He is simply rooted. And in that rootedness, he becomes unbearable to those who only know how to float.
He used to think he was broken, that his tiredness was a flaw, that his need for silence was a weakness to be corrected. But now he sees the exhaustion was sacred, a refusal from the soul to keep marching in the wrong direction. He wasn't weak, he was too awake to keep pretending. His fatigue was not burnout, it was mourning, a silent grief for all the selves he abandoned in order to be accepted. And now he honors that grief. He listens to what it tried to say all along, that a life spent chasing approval is a slow suicide, that to be loved at the cost of erasing yourself is not love, it's exile, that to belong everywhere by not being anyone is a kind of death far worse than solitude. And in this clarity, a quiet forgiveness arises, not toward others, but toward the self that endured so much just to be seen.
There is no triumph, no great declaration, no final applause. Only a man who no longer needs to be understood to feel real. He walks through the same streets, sleeps in the same bed, replies to the same questions, but something has shifted. He doesn't sell himself anymore, doesn't shrink, doesn't polish his edges to fit into others' comfort zones. He isn't hostile, just whole. And wholeness in a fragmented world is an act of quiet rebellion. He has stopped trying to escape himself, stopped editing his truth to make it more digestible. He no longer needs to be followed to feel he's going somewhere, no longer needs to be praised to feel he's doing it right. He simply lives with presence, with weight, with eyes that no longer seek permission. And now, he's not exhausted, because he no longer wants to be admired, only to be.